Reform Act of 1832 was the result of a long struggle, both in the streets and in Parliament. How you could vote was determined by your country or borough, or whether the Parliament deemed if your area was eligible or not. In some places, all men could vote, but in most places, it was based on whether you paid certain taxes or owned certain property. There was a lot of criticism from people regarding the electoral system. In the end, though, only men who owned property worth a certain amount could vote, which cut out most of the working classes, and only men who could afford to pay to stand for election could be MPs. These reforms did not go far enough to silence for protest. In the end, the Reform Act made larger the electorate vote from around 366,000 to 650,000 people, which was almost 18% of the total adult male population in England and Wales. Most of the women and people were still excluded from voting, and the act failed to introduce a secret ballot. The working classes felt betrayed by an act which made no difference to their lives. However, the reform of Parliament had started, and this started to make the way for the popular agitation of the Chartists.
As the Industrial Revolution grew, thousands of factories sprang up all over the country. This resulted in dangerous machinery and horrific working conditions. Another negative result of the Industrial Revolution was child labor. Very young children were working extremely long hours and could be severely punished for any mistakes, no matter how minor. So, in 1833, the government passed a Factory Act to improve working conditions for the children in the factories. The basic act was that there would be no child workers under 9 years of age. All employers must have an age certificate for their workers. Children of 9 to 13 could work a maximum of 9 hours a day. Children of 13 to 18 could work a maximum of 12 hours a day. The children were not to work at night. 2 hours of schooling were required each day for the children, and 4 factory inspectors would be appointed to enforce this law. However, the passing of this act did not mean the mistreatment of children stopped overnight, or even at all, and some rules were most likely bent in dreadful ways. Still, conditions may have improved in some areas, and action is always the first step.
Women's suffrage started at 1848 to 1920. Women's suffrage is when women were not allowed to vote, but only men were allowed to vote. Women were upset about this, and they made lots of organizations to support their claim, but it helped a little bit. There will be women who would try to vote, but they would be sent to jail for that. It took years for them to get close to be able to vote. Then later in the years, they kept doing their support, and that allowed them to be able to be 30 years old and older to vote. And then in 1920, every woman 18 and above were allowed to vote.
The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 outlawed slavery across Great Britain and its colonies. It was passed after a large slave rebellion occurred in the British colony of Jamaica. It freed all slaves under the age of 6 and allowed other slaves to be known as apprentices. This was eventually overturned and allowed freedom for all slaves a couple years later. Because the slave owners felt like they were losing their property, the British government was forced to pay them £20 million. This was actually only paid back in 2015, because it was 5% of the British GDP at the time. Eventually slavery was outlawed across the world, as this was known as the catalyst to help slavery be fully abolished.
Okay, by this time in history, British had established a massive empire across the whole world. From the beginning of the 1800s all the way through the 1900s, up to about 1921 was when they were at the peak of their empire. During the 1800s and 1900s, there was no loss of the British Empire. There was only gaining of countries to add to their empire. But this gain stopped with the world wars. After World War I and World War II, the British Empire was nearly bankrupt. With small loans of America of $4.3 billion, the empire built itself back up, but it was never the same. The countries under British rule sensed weakness in the entirety of the British Empire and started rebelling. With the lack of people and troops to keep them in check, they had to let go all of their countries in Africa. And from there was a common theme of them letting go different countries like Canada, Australia, all the way leading down to the British Empire was just back in Great Britain again. So that was the loss of the British Empire.